Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of the Goodcast Show. So my guest today is a highly regarded academic, activist and expert in international relations and Middle Eastern studies, with over a decade of experience in leading diplomatic and academic initiatives. As the founding director of the Asia Middle East Center for Research and Dialogue, AMEC, he has been at the forefront of fostering strategic dialogue between Asia and the Middle East since 2015. He's a well-known voice on international affairs, offering insights on global and regional geopolitics across leading media outlets, including Al Jazeera, Russia Today, CGTV, China Daily, Astro Avani, The Star, as well as local podcasts such as Keluar Sekejap and Ubah TV. But today he's topping all of that by coming on the Goodcast Show, which we are very honored to have him on. But today the discussion will center around his book, a book where he has contributed 2 articles to the Middle East and the Malay world, contemporary issues and future challenges. You can get this book on Gerak Budaya, which is now available for purchase. The links will be shared in the description, so please get this book. I've read it. And let me tell you, if you will get a different understanding of Islam and its growth in the region and the connection from Middle East to the Malay land. Now, today's discussion will also center around current topics. So we can't wait. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. I've been following him ever since his appearance on Keluar Sekejap, and I truly love the things that he say. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Muslim Imran. How are you, sir?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Vinod.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. So let's start with this book. You contributed 2 articles to this book, where the first one being Malaysia's attitude towards Israel, and you categorize them from each prime minister to what is now. You also talk about the NGOs and how their contribution to the Palestine struggle has been since way back when. So, I mean, please share with us your experience writing those articles and putting it in this book.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for having me on the Goodcast Show, and I'm very glad to speak to your audience.
Thank you.
This book is inspired by a conference that our think tank organized jointly with other think tanks about 2 years ago. It was held in University of Malaya in October 2022. And in that conference, we discussed the topic shown in the title, the relations between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. We delved into different dimensions. In my case, I spoke about the Palestinian issue, being a Palestinian myself. And eventually, when the editors decided to come out with a book through Gerak Budaya, I wrote 2 chapters. One of them focuses on Malaysia's foreign policy towards Israel, a subject that is not talked about that much in Malaysia, although Israelis have written on the topic, interestingly. Mm-hmm. And the other one was on the Palestine-oriented NGOs. This is a cluster of NGOs that is very active in Malaysia and continue to expand and be active, but are not discussed academically. Their leaders, their members, their projects are everywhere, but I have not seen much academic writing on that in this cluster of NGOs. So in the 2 chapters, I look at different dimensions. In the one on Israel, I try to see how the Malaysian authorities treated the Israeli attempts to normalize with Malaysia. Of course, when we talk about normalization, it usually starts with the Israelis reaching out to others, because Israel is still framed and is still seen by most of the Afro-Asian nations as an apartheid colonial regime. So even countries that have already normalized relations with Israel are usually not that proactive in reaching out to Israel. It was Israel that reached to them. And in the case of Malaysia, there have been a lot of efforts from Israel to normalize relations with Malaysia. They, in the early days of Malaya's independence and even before independence, they sent envoys to meet with decision makers in Malaya back then, and to the extent of setting up a commercial office for Israel in Kuala Lumpur, which was operating in Kuala Lumpur for several years in the early 60s and run by an Israeli diplomat in the name of Moshe Yagar, who wrote later about Malaysia-Israel relations and wrote about Asia-Israel relations. But fortunately for the Palestinian struggle, this commercial office was closed down after the 6 days war and Israel's expansion in 1967. The response here domestically was very aggressive against any relations with Israel. So yeah, Israel always reaches out to others because it knows that it's seen as a colonial power. Well, it is framed differently in the West. If you go to the US or to Europe, up until the genocide that started last year in Gaza, Israel was seen favorably by many in the Western communities because they see it as an extension to the Western civilization. The same faces, interestingly. The majority of the Israelis of today, especially the Ashkenazi Jewish Israelis, are Europeans actually, not Middle Easterners. And they can hardly find a link, a genetic link with ancient Israelites of the Middle East. So the Europeans, the Western world sees Israel as a part of them. And at one point of time, one former Spanish prime minister said that we have to protect Israel because it's like the shield or the forward post of the Western civilization, which protects us from barbarians, something like that. But in Asia, in Africa, in the Muslim majority countries, Israel is still seen as a colonial, hegemonic power that has dispossessed its enemies' lands, in this case the Palestinians. And I thought it's good to discuss how the different prime ministers approach this issue. Please read the book.
Yes,
I would be glad if you have a look at the different chapters. You will find that in recent years, especially in starting from the 70s and especially from the 80s, Malaysia has started to become more assertive in supporting the Palestinians, and venues for Israel to normalize relations with Malaysia, be it diplomatically, culturally, or economically, have been pressured and limited. Unfortunately, the only successful Israeli normalization efforts with Malaysia have been the economic ones.
Yes.
As of 2 or 3 years ago, bilateral trade between Malaysia and Israel reached up to $1.5 billion, mainly in high-tech technologies. But comparatively, look at the Malaysian-Palestinian trade relations. At about the same period, it was only $1.5 million.
Wow.
So Malaysia's economic relations with Israel are 1,000 times bigger than those with the Palestinians. So one way of helping the Palestinian struggle is actually doing business with the Palestinians or reducing business with the Israelis. And
but why do you think this is so? Why is there such a huge disparity?
I think Israel uses a lot of international companies to do business. Sometimes it relies on MNCs who have operations in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and others. But sometimes it's private businesses as well. As an approach, the Malaysian state is not welcoming Israeli-linked businesses, but there will always be some, attempts to proliferate the Israeli business here and there. And I'm very hopeful that the Malaysian society, the Malaysian civil society, the Malaysian state, and the Malaysian government will continue to curb any Israeli infiltration into the Malaysian economy. Because, honestly speaking, forget about the business perspective. Look at it from a security perspective. Once Israel comes in, they become dangerous. Look at what they have done in Lebanon, for instance, very recently. They got involved through some fake companies that they set up in Europe in exporting Taiwanese technologies, pager technologies, to Lebanon. These pagers are not only used by resistance fighters, they are used by doctors in hospitals, by many civilians as well in Lebanon. And Israel carried out a massacre just like that because it has these links in the business world. So to be safe, keep Israeli business out. So that's one of the chapters. The other one is more focused on NGOs and the civil society. And something that is close to my heart because I personally was involved in Palestine advocacy NGOs in Malaysia for many years. So I tried to map out which NGOs are interested in Palestine, which ones are very focused on the Palestinian issue, and why have they emerged. And this is a part of My research in my PhD, which I'm still completing in University of Malaya. So I thought that the public might be interested because very little is written about these NGOs, but they are very active. I mean, there is no week that passes without a big show, rally, program, conference, or activity done by these active and good NGOs.
Nice. I mean, it's amazing to see Malaysia actually taking such an active role. And in your book, you did. There's so many different types. I had no idea that we had that many NGOs, but it's amazing that they're doing the work that they're doing. Now, before we get into the topic, let's first put some context to this. What is, I mean, because you actually brought this point up right before we started this podcast, you were talking about how the entire issue of the Palestinian struggle is oftentimes packaged to the outside world as an Islamic struggle, which alienates other groups. The Hindus, for example, or whoever, because the whole perception is, oh, this is your problem, not mine. What has been the Malaysian attitude towards this struggle?
As a Palestinian, I appreciate any interest and any support in the Palestinian or towards the Palestinian struggle. But from my personal experience here in Malaysia, the issue is always viewed from a religious prism and perspective. Which causes misunderstandings and confusion, because the Palestinian people, to start with, the Palestinian people are not Muslim only. We have Muslims, Christians, and we have smaller communities, even Baha'i community. There are Palestinian Jews, a small community of Palestinian Jews. And therefore, those who think that we as Muslims should support the Palestinians because they are Muslims, they start with the wrong premise. It's not accurate. That's one. Number two, the struggle in Palestine is not for a religious agenda. The Palestinians, be it Muslims, Christians, or others, are struggling for freedom. They want the basic human rights, the dignity. They want emancipation. They want liberation. They want to have a state of their own. And this struggle should be supported by anybody who believes in basic, human rights. Yeah. Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, anybody who believes that other humans are equal should support this struggle. In addition to that, of course, for Muslims in particular, here in Malaysia and across the world, the idea of fighting against injustice is very entrenched in the Islamic principles and in the Islamic doctrine, in the Holy Quran, in the traditions of the Prophet, in the struggle of the Prophet himself against the dominance of the powerful in Mecca. All of that points to the importance for Muslims anywhere in the world to support a national liberation struggle. And that's why a country like Malaysia was very supportive of the struggle in South Africa against apartheid, even though the majority of the South Africans are not Muslims. But a Muslim majority country like Malaysia was at the forefront of supporting anti-apartheid efforts. Currently, many in Malaysia see the Palestinian issue as a Muslim versus Jewish problem, which is not true, which is not accurate. And I am sorry to tell those who think this way that you are wrong. We want the issue to be framed correctly. This is a struggle for freedom. This is a struggle for human rights. This is a struggle for liberation. And we want everybody to support it. And look at the global support. The country that actually stick its neck and took serious proactive action against Israel in the international legal framework is not a Muslim country. South Africa went all the way to the ICJ to charge Israel for genocide, while 57 Muslim majority countries or members of the OIC, could not achieve that. But of course, there are also other Muslim countries that are actively supporting the Palestinian struggle. And as we see now, the resistance axis, Iran, Yemen, and other countries are in full force supporting the Palestinian struggle. So yeah, but coming back to Malaysia, I think it's good if the issue is framed as a struggle for freedom. And while it's good that Muslims would like to do more for their Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine, they should not, steer away others, non-Muslims who are interested in the Palestinian issue. And from my communication with many Malaysian friends in the civil society in particular, I see that many Christians, Hindus, Buddhists are very supportive of Palestine, but not as many of them are engaged in public debate and discourse on Palestine here in Malaysia. Maybe the fact that Malaysia's public discourse is very heavily influenced by racial.
I think that's the main problem.
Yeah, politics and racial ideology. Maybe this, in a way, limits any such initiatives from non-Muslims. But there are still some active figures in the political and civil society framework that are always speaking up on Palestine. I see people like Tian Chua, former member of parliament, Tian Chua, people like current Human Resources Minister, YB Stevenson, are frequently speaking on the Palestinian issue and supporting the Palestinian struggle, and I highly appreciate that. And of course, I expect others to engage them, to express their appreciation for this, and to invite others to join. Definitely.
Now, speaking of the Malaysian response to this issue, we have seen of late, I think the entire conflict in this timeline started about a year ago, and we saw a lot of Malaysians boycotting brands and all that. Companies that had Israeli connections, or companies who were claimed to have been supporting the entire Israel invasion. But I just want to get your perspective on this. Is there a difference between the economic companies, the economic section of this, as opposed to not recognizing the state of Israel politically? Is there a difference that we should know, that we should practice?
Of course, for Israel, they try to get anything. If they can get the full package, diplomatic recognition, economic relations, cultural exchanges, and other relations, they would go for it. This is what they have with the US, for instance. This is what they have with many European countries. But in the Afro-Asian region, the people of these countries are still very suspicious of Israel. And anybody who watches the news in the last 1 year will rightly be suspicious of Israel's intentions, because Israel is not only bombing the Palestinians, it's bombing everywhere.
Everyone, yeah.
So many in Asia and Africa, probably in Latin America as well, try to limit their interactions with Israel as much as possible. So in the diplomatic front, some countries recognized Israel and started to have diplomatic relations, but many of these countries still do not have trade relations with Israel, or do not have cultural relations. Look at some Arab countries which, because of the developments of the 60s and 70s, found themselves in relations with Israel. Countries like Egypt, or later Jordan, they normalized diplomatic relations. They have some security communication, which I'm totally against, which I disagree with, but they did not welcome any cultural exchanges. There are hardly any cultural relations taking place between Egypt, the Egyptian society, even the Egyptian state, and Israel, even though they have diplomatic relations. The same applies to Jordan. If a public intellectual starts to reach out to Israeli public intellectuals and visit them and welcome them, they will be framed as traitors in Egypt, Jordan, and many other countries. So, back to the difference between the political and the economic normalization and relations with Israel. There is difference, of course, but the result is the same. If Israel starts to talk to one party, they will make sure that they normalize in all fronts. Therefore, our call for all of our friends worldwide that Israel is a genocidal, apartheid, colonial regime. Don't give them face. Don't give them an economic platform. Don't give them a cultural platform. Isolate them internationally. That's why the calls amongst the Palestinians have been for BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, for the last 2 decades, and even before that. The calls to all of our friends worldwide, if you really believe that Palestinians should get justice, don't trade with Israel. Don't invest in Israel. Don't welcome Israeli diplomats. Don't welcome Israeli even sports and cultural envoys, because you might say that let's separate politics from culture or politics from sports, but Israel doesn't. Israel has always mixed, and interestingly, the international community has always mixed them. When the Ukraine war started, suddenly the whole Western world decided to boycott and isolate Russia from FIFA, from other sports platforms. But when it comes to Palestine, the same parties come and tell us, no, don't mix politics and sports, but you mix it. So we want to pressure the Israeli regime so that they abandon their racist Zionist ideology. We're not against individuals. Sometimes people are mistaken and think Palestinians are against Jews or anti-Semitic. No. Number one, Palestinians are Semitic. We are probably more Semite than the other side. Number two, Palestinians want justice for all. If the Israeli regime continues to occupy Palestine, justice will be denied to the majority, to the original inhabitants. We want Israel to change its policies. We want the Israeli regime to abandon Zionism and eventually a Palestinian state to emerge in historical Palestine where everybody can live in peace. To achieve that, the Israeli regime and the Israeli institutions should suffer a bit. They will never abandon their extremist ideology and extremist policies if you continue to trade with them, if you continue to hug them, you continue to give them platform.
Definitely.
It's not going to work. So political and economic boycott might be different, but they're both essential and important. And different countries have different ways of contributing. In the case of Malaysia, if there is $1.5 billion of bilateral economic trade, let's start there. Let's limit that. Luckily, there is no diplomatic exchange. I hope this will continue. Cultural exchange, don't give them a platform. They already have a lot of platforms in the West. So don't contaminate your public discourse with their genocidal ideas.
Definitely. Speaking again, I think it's an interesting point. You talk about pressures put on them by the global community. So recently, Malaysia opposed Israel's admission to the Asian Development Bank, ADB, which, by the way, just for your knowledge, it was set up way back in 1966 as a means of establishing prosperity among Asia-Pacific countries while eradicating hardcore poverty. Now, interestingly enough, Malaysia was the only country out of the 69 member countries who opposed Israel joining the ADB. Other Muslim majority nations such as Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Brunei, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Maldives, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkey did not oppose this. So why is there a difference in the global Muslim world attitude towards Israel as opposed to Malaysia?
I would say one factor is that Malaysia is a democracy. So the decision makers have to respect the general sentiment and the public interest and public opinion. And if you have a poll, the majority of the Malaysian people do not want to see Israel, gain more grounds.
Definitely.
In the case of many other OIC states, we can have a different discussion about whether they are democratic or not. I think democracy in the Muslim world is very, very weak. In our think tank, we actually have an initiative focused on democracy and transparency initiative. And I can tell you that our political institutions across the OIC are not that democratic. So public opinion is not always taken into account when they make their foreign policy. But in Malaysia, it is taken into account, which is good. That's one. Number two, the Malaysian decision makers, the Malaysian political elite is ideologically pro-Palestine. And you don't need to, search for a lot of evidence. You can have a brief conversation with any Malaysian politician, minister, member of parliament. Most of them feel very strongly for Palestine and would like to see an end to the ongoing injustice in Palestine. So they certainly won't give platform for Israel anywhere. In the case of many other Muslim countries, there is a strong feeling for Palestine, even amongst decision makers, but it's about priorities. It's about maybe cold calculations. Sometimes we are getting this economic interest. Let's give them this. In the case of the Abrahamic Accords, for instance, in the Trump era, several Muslim countries normalized with Israel because of considerations that have nothing to do with the public opinion, that have nothing to do with even the national interests. It was more towards regime survival. I'll give an example, won't be controversial. Sudan, for instance. Sudan went through a military coup, public unrest first, then military coup, then a crisis. Now it's embroiled in civil war. The military regime back then, during the Trump era, was, of course, number one, under pressure to open up to the Western world and to work with Israel. So the generals thought that in order to stay in power, the best way is to talk to Israel. Does that reflect the sentiment? No, the Sudanese people are amongst the most pro-Palestine, anti-Israel communities in the whole of Africa. I've been to Sudan and I've seen how strong they feel for Palestine, but nobody consulted them. The same applies to almost every other Muslim country that normalized relations with Israel, with, of course, a few exceptions. I don't want to start mentioning countries because that will become more controversial and you will have people complaining.
Recently, of course, unfortunately, there's been Hamas lost a leader in the form of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. He was basically known as the international diplomatic face of Hamas, and he has been taking part in peace talks to reach a ceasefire in the Palestinian enclave. How would his death impact peace talks, and can there ever be peace in Palestine?
Of course, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh was yet another heinous Israeli war crime, because in war you don't kill messengers, you don't kill diplomats, you don't assassinate them in other sovereign nations. But Israel doesn't bother about international law anyway. Ismail Haniyeh was a very charismatic, well-respected figure, not only within Hamas, but also across the Palestinian political spectrum and regionally. And you've seen the footage after his assassination where they performed the funeral prayers on him in Tehran and then again in Doha. Interestingly, and this probably has not happened that often in Islamic history in 1,400 years, that a Muslim figure, a public figure, a leader, is earning the love and respect of both major Muslim sects, the Sunnis and the Shia. That doesn't happen often, you know. So Ismail Haniyeh was well regarded by many people. He was seen as the political face of Hamas, a diplomat. His loss will definitely, be felt, and it is felt in the Palestinian context. But Israel doesn't want to talk to anybody. Israel wants to expand its hegemony. That's the Israeli logic. They're not looking for partners. They're not looking for peace. They have wasted 30 years of peace talks since the Oslo Accords of the 1990s because they're not interested in peace and they're not interested in partners. They are interested in hegemony and dominance. The North American settlers signed some 360 treaties with the Red Indians, with the original inhabitants of North America. But today, a few hundred years later, where do you see the Red Indians? They were wiped out. It was a settler colonial project from the beginning, and it's the same in Israel. Israel, the right and the left agree that they should have Israel or Palestine as their homeland, and they should get rid of the original inhabitants. This started early on with the early leaders, people like Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. He actually drafted a plan called Plan Dalit, along with his army generals, to orchestrate ethnic cleansing. One Israeli historian studied this thoroughly in the 90s and published a very good book entitled The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Professor Ilan Pape, he's lecturing in the UK right now. They planned to ethnically cleanse Palestine from day one. That was the plan from day one. It was not that there was a war and there was a decision by the United Nations to partition the land, so they accepted this, we didn't accept it. No, nothing to do with that. Zionism is a genocidal ideology. Zionism believes that the Jewish people are more superior to others, that they have right in Palestine and they have exclusive right in Palestine. Everybody else has to leave. The question is when and how to leave. So from the beginning, Israel started with the idea of getting rid of as many Palestinians as possible. This carried on all the way until recent years. The war in Gaza now, the genocide in Gaza now is not something exceptional or out of context. No, Israel from day one has been genocidal. You Google Khan al-Ahmar, for instance. You Google what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods in Jerusalem, the war that took place in 2021. You read about the 7 million Palestinian refugees who are still scattered across the world and the right of return. Israel was never interested in any Palestinian coming back. Israel is never interested in peace. They undermined the peace process for 30 years. So now Ismail Haniyeh was the political figure who would actually negotiate to get a ceasefire in Gaza, to end the ongoing fighting. Netanyahu wasn't interested in that. Netanyahu is more interested in perpetual war. Why is that so? Because that is the only way to achieve his right-wing fantasies. Maybe 10 or 20 years ago, when people talked about Israel dreaming, or the right wing in Israel dreaming to establish a state from the Nile to the Euphrates, from Egypt to Iraq, if people talked about it 20, 30 years, they will be dismissed as conspiracy theory fans. But now there are videos surfacing, maps surfacing, plans surfacing. It is spoken about by members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. It's spoken about by even ministers. The use, for instance, of nuclear bombs is talked about by Israeli ministers. Why is that so? Because they really believe that they have to drive out as many Arabs, Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, Jordanian from their land to establish so-called homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. So killing Ismail Haniyeh is very, in this context, killing Ismail Haniyeh is very natural, because they don't want to negotiate. They're not negotiating with President Mahmoud Abbas, who is very pacifist, who is not challenging their authority over the West Bank. Do you want them to negotiate with somebody who is actually fighting back? They killed Hassan Nasrallah, and they are willing to kill anybody who opposes this agenda. They're not looking for partners. And this goes back to their ideology. Zionism is the problem. Now Zionism is powerful. So it is committing massacres, genocide, etc. If Zionism is defeated as an ideology, as an idea, or if the regime is weakened, we will see different policies. When they were weak in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, they were willing to talk peace to the Palestinians. But when they took over the state, when Zionism was empowered and gained a regime and power, you see a very different policy. Not that the ideology changed, but the strategies and operations changed.
Based on your answer, I'm just curious about this. Does the philosophy and the method of Zionism reflect the wants of the Israeli people, particularly towards Palestine?
The absolute majority of the Israeli citizens are Zionists.
Oh, okay.
Of course, the majority of the younger generation is brainwashed. They were born Zionist. The society is Zionist. The school education system, etc. So it's somehow like Nazi Germany in the 1940s.
Before the war.
Maybe not in the early 20s, because they were a very small minority. But Israel, after the establishment of Israel, started to indoctrinate the younger generation. So it started with, of course, left-wing secular Zionists, but eventually, since the 1970s, right-wing started to rise, and eventually now the absolute majority of the Israeli society is, supporting right-wing Zionism, be it nationalist Zionism or religious Zionism. Both worse than the other. Each one of them is an extremist group by itself. But even secular Zionism was a problem. So again, I'm saying the problem is Zionism. Okay. Zionism is no different from fascism or Nazism. It started and emerged in Europe. It's a byproduct of the geopolitical and ideological battlefields in Europe of the late 19th century and early 20th century. The Jewish people, of course, in Europe were persecuted. Unlike the Jewish communities in North Africa or the Arab and Muslim world, they were welcomed as citizens. But the Jewish people in Europe were persecuted across centuries. In the late 19th century, Jewish emancipation in Europe meant you either merge with the society or you create something of your own. So those who created something of their own, the lovers of Zion, eventually became the Zionist movement. And the word Zionism was coined in this era. So one political Zionist leader from Austria came up with the idea of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people. He wrote a small booklet called the Judenstaat, or the Jewish State. Theodor Herzl was a Jewish Austrian journalist.
Okay.
He led the mainly Western European Jewish community to believe in Zionism. They created a Zionist organization in 1897 they had their first World Zionist Organization conference, and eventually they started to negotiate with world powers how to set up a homeland for the Jewish people. So the Zionism and the Jewish state were actually a European problem. It was not even a problem in the Muslim world or in the Arab world. It was a European problem. They were racist against the Jewish people. They were later on they became very brutal, the Nazis and the fascists. But they had a problem. And when the Zionist movement managed to lobby and negotiate a settlement with some European powers, their solution was to dump this Jewish community of Europe in the Middle East and let the Middle East have this problem. So they got rid of their problem in our land.
Wow, okay.
It, of course, served their colonial geopolitical interests as European powers. If we go back 100 years back, we will see that the British, the French, most particularly, were the superpowers of the time. They were already cutting and dissecting the Middle East. They were dreaming of conquering the Ottoman Empire, which is the old sick man of Europe. When the sick man of Europe collapsed in the First World War, they immediately started to draw and chart maps. The British and the French signed Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which literally drew the maps that we see today in the Middle East. Why are Palestinians and Jordanians living in two different countries when they are one family? When they are like literally one community and one tribe? Why are the Palestinians and Lebanese two different nationalities? Because the French drew up the map of Lebanon and the British drew the map of Palestine, and this took this and this took that. There is an interesting example also here in Southeast Asia of the Dutch-English treaty, I think of 1825 or 1824, where they exchanged territories.
Yes,
and this is why we see some part of this region Indonesian and some part Malaysian. The colonial powers plotted with the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, and eventually the Zionist movement was successful in persuading the British, most particularly, to set up a homeland for the Jewish people of Europe in Palestine. Most of the Jewish people of the world did not like the idea back then. And when immigration started to happen peacefully, very few Jewish people migrated to Palestine. Only in the 1930s and 40s, when, number one, Nazism was on the rise and Jewish people were persecuted in Europe, that many people started to come. Number two, when Israel was set up and Israel's regime, the Mossad and other institutions started to carry out terrorist attacks in Arab countries against the Jewish people, that Jewish people in Arab countries like Yemen, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq started to migrate to Israel. So Zionism was forced upon the Jewish people. And if you look at the ideology itself, it's a play with words, a play with holy scriptures. Many Jewish people now, especially now when they're opening their eyes to what's happening in Palestine, are saying, not in my name. There are even groups like that in the US, or Jewish Voices for Peace. They say that Judaism is not about what's happening. It's not about genocide. We do not agree with that. And there are, of course, Orthodox Jewish groups across the world, Naturi Karta, for instance, and others in Europe and in America, who do not accept the very idea of Israel. So the idea of Israel is some sort of a messianic and doomsday idea that we have to set up a homeland for the Jewish people to get rid of everybody else, and eventually the Messiah will come and lead us to victory.
Okay.
The problem we have is that many white Anglo-Saxon evangelical Christians buy that idea. So here comes the United States. Since the 1950s, the United States became the world's biggest fan of Zionism. They have been supporting it. People like Trump, the current generation of American presidents, people like Trump and even Biden are fanatical supporters of Zionism. So sometimes Christian Zionism can become a bigger problem than Jewish Zionism. So again, Zionism is the problem. The idea is the problem.
Now, I just want to go back before we move to the next segment. Of course, the passing of Ismail Haniyeh is definitely a sad one, but what would that do to Hamas as an organization? How will they move forward without him?
The Palestinian resistance movements are actually used to losing their top leadership because this is a struggle for freedom. early Palestinian national liberation movements like Fatah have lost almost their entire leadership, but they still managed to survive and carry on. Groups like the Popular Front also lost top leaderships. The Secretary General of the Popular Front was assassinated in the early 2000s, Abu Ali Mustafa. The top leaders of Fatah were arrested by Israel, people like Marwan Barghouthi, who are still in Israeli jail for more than 20 years. Hamas, compared to others, is more used to losing its leaders in this struggle. So the founder and the iconic figure of Hamas was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was an old handicapped school teacher who was actually very persuasive, that he led to the foundation of now today the most prominent Palestinian political and military struggle group. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was assassinated by Israel in 2004, but the movement elected another leader, and the following leader, Abdelaziz Rizvi, was assassinated. They elected another leader. So now assassinating Haniya is, of course, to demoralize the Palestinians, to let them down, to feel, to put the feeling that your struggle is not working, you're losing your top leaders. But the organization is intact. Only 2 or 3 days after the assassination of Haniya, Hamas top leadership had a meeting, elected a new leader, and business as usual. The struggle continues. Even if they wipe out the entire leadership of any Palestinian group, like what happened to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, Hezbollah is still fighting as of this morning. Hezbollah has carried out a military operation at the border that dealt Israeli army a very big blow. The point is, you have to defeat the idea. You don't just, and these groups are not in the early stage. They are not in the infant stage. These groups are well established. Hamas today, in 2024, is actually the largest Palestinian political group by membership. It has hundreds of thousands of members. It has run the government in Gaza for 17 years. It has a wide network of international relations. It even has, its own ideological, principles, its charter, its second charter or political document. Killing the top leader will not stop it. They will choose another one, and they have done so. But what it will do is it will make the Palestinian people more determined to fight back. And some people would use the term radicalize the movement. I don't think it will radicalize Hamas or any Palestinian faction, because the goal is very clear. Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, Popular Front, be it Islamist, secular, Marxist, or whatever, any major Palestinian political group wants one goal: liberation of Palestine. If Israel was willing early on to give the Palestinians something, the course of history would have changed. But Israel from day one is not willing to share our own land with them. I mean, they are colonizers. They forced us out, and they're not willing to even give us any of our rights. So it was a joke that Israel thought actually that the whole Palestinian problem was solved and swept under the carpet up until 2023. Netanyahu was actually selling the idea that the whole world should normalize with Israel, and the Palestinians are a small problem that I can solve. We'll give them more jobs. We will improve whatever in their facilities and infrastructure, and that's it. No, the Palestinians want freedom. It's different from a domestic problem where you can actually negotiate and settle it. In the case of Palestine, the core idea of Zionism denies others the very existence. Zionism means wipe out the Palestinians. So how do you expect the Palestinians to live with that? They will not. Even if a single Palestinian is left, he or she will continue to fight.
Now, before we go to the next segment, because of course I want to touch on the Iran's announcement, and of course the today morning was a very eventful day. They have launched 180 missiles, but we'll get to that. But before that, I think about a year back, you, especially in this book, your article, your chapter focuses on the attitudes of different prime ministers, different BN, at that time was BN, the attitude towards Israel and all that. In your analysis of this current Malaysian government, have they done enough for the Palestinian to basically support Palestine as a country?
I have to acknowledge that the Malaysian government across the OIC and across the Muslim world is actually one of the most outspoken compared to many, whether in the OIC meetings or at the global stage. The Malaysian Prime Minister, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, has spoken extensively on the Palestinian issue. I've seen his videos speaking in Russia, in Germany, and across the world. And we do need this strong political stand because, unfortunately, many of our leaders in the Middle East, especially the Arab world, are either silent or, sorry to say, complicit in what's going on in Gaza. And the very simple act of speaking up is not even there. So, no, Malaysia is ahead of many of these OIC countries. The Malaysian narrative is very clear that this is a disposition, this is a colonization, it has to end. But do we as Palestinians expect more? Yes, of course. I have to be very honest that we are facing a genocide. Do we expect our friends to do more? Yes, we expect our friends to do more. Are they doing enough? They are doing good, but we want them to do more. Why is that so? Because if you give Israel more time, by 2 or 3 years from now, we will be wiped out in Gaza. Israel has killed more than 50,000 in Gaza in 1 year only. They have injured more than 100,000. They have displaced more than 1.5 million. If you give Israel another 1 or 2 years, Gaza might be finished. So imagine a regime that actually is having designs to do the same in the West Bank. They do. And one of their ministers, their finance minister, Smotrich, publicly spoke about this as early as 2017. They're only waiting for the chance to do the same in the West Bank. Today, as we speak, they are talking about Lebanon being a part of the historical Jewish homeland. So they also started to dehumanize the Lebanese people, and they started to plot to steal Lebanese land. This is the kind of regime that we are facing. So we expect all of our friends, be it Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, we expect them to continue what they're doing and to take it to the next level. How to take it to the next level? Isolate Israel further in international community. Maybe sign up for another ICJ case against Israel. Bring Israeli leaders to the ICC to be charged for war crimes. Cut off any trade or economic, cultural, political relations with Israel. Make sure that the Israelis are very isolated and under pressure so they change their policies. We are not genocidal. Some people claim the Palestinians want to get rid of all of the Israelis and kill all of them. No. That's not, you go and ask children in Palestine. That's not what we want. We want an end to the Zionist occupation of Palestine. We want to live in peace and dignity. How to achieve that? Israel as a regime has to be dismantled. Apartheid has to be dismantled. And Zionism as a racist ideology has to be abandoned. Just like slavery was banned in the past, just like South Africa's apartheid regime was dismantled, just like fascism and Nazism were abandoned. We want Zionism and the Israeli regime to be abandoned.
Definitely. Now, at the recent UN General Assembly, many leaders shared their thoughts about what's going on in Gaza. There was about 22 leaders who condemned what's happening. Just want to get your opinion on this. Is this nothing more than lip service, or do you expect that the international community to actually intervene and make more solid efforts to stop what's happening now?
It goes back to the UN and its role. The UN is not an enforcement agency. Even the United Nations Security Council, which supposedly has more power to implement, still does not have a standing army or an arm to implement its resolutions. So we should not fall into the trap of having high expectations from the UN in the first place. But can the UN help? Yeah, the little help that the UN platforms can provide, we should gain the maximum there. So if Israel can be further isolated, yes, why not? Now 140 or 150 countries usually vote for ceasefire and to give Palestinians their full right. If we can make it 160, that's an achievement. 3 or 4 European countries have just recognized the state of Palestine. That is good. That's a progress. Israelis are being charged in the ICC. That's a progress. Will this end the genocide? No. Will this give the Palestinians a liberated homeland? No. But is this better than nothing? Yes, it definitely is better than nothing. I don't expect diplomacy alone to end the occupation of Palestine. However, I don't expect to see Palestine free and independent without the use of diplomacy. So diplomacy is one tool of many. And this is actually the difference between the majority of the Palestinian political groups and President Mahmoud Abbas' approach. President Mahmoud Abbas' approach has been to abandon armed struggle and focus more on diplomatic struggle. And sometimes some popular struggle like protests and demonstrations and so on. Every other major Palestinian faction believes that that's not enough. Israel is a brutal military occupation. You cannot continue to throw roses at them. They're never going to change heart just because you speak more eloquently. No. You have to have your own power. You have to fight back. Just like the Algerians fought against the French annexation and occupations, like the Vietnamese fought against the American and before that the French occupation. The Indonesians fought against the Dutch. The Israeli settler colonial occupation of Palestine is not like the British colonization of Malaya or the British colonization of many other parts of India and others. Don't get me wrong, the British colonization was terrible. They committed massacres even here in Malaya. They committed massacres and famine in India and other parts. However, they were 1,000,000 times more rational than the current Israeli genocidal occupation. The current Israeli settler colonial occupation of Palestine is no different from the white colonization of North America. They will only settle to, a new place without original inhabitants. They wouldn't mind. Israel wouldn't mind having maybe 100,000 Palestinians left, but not a few million Palestinians left.
No, I'm just curious because I had a guest on. I think I've mentioned this to you. He was very familiar with the LTTE struggle, and as you know, they too were eradicated. What he told me was that there was a purpose. The whole reason behind the genocide was because there were outside forces who wanted control of Sri Lanka because it was a very profitable port to have, right, in terms of trade and international trade and all that. And the LTT was opposed to this, and they were the only ones standing in the way of all these big geopolitical forces. As someone who's been, this conflict has been there since I was a kid. I've been seeing it on the news and all that. What is the purpose of eradicating Palestine and Palestinians? What would that serve?
It will serve Israel in creating a Jewish-only state.
That's all. That's the only reason.
That's a dream that they have had from the early days of the establishment of Israel, especially the right-wing Zionists. People like Zeev Jabotinsky, the father of the Israeli right-wing, has written extensively about what they call reformist Zionism. They literally wanted to wipe out all the Palestinian population to have a Jewish-only nation.
That's the only reason.
Yeah, they think of a culturally, ethnically, racially pure state of Israel, when the whole idea is very ridiculous because the Jewish population of Palestine they are not one race, they're not one ethnicity. They've come from all over the world. Many of them believe in the Jewish culture. They don't even believe in the Jewish God. Many of them, at least in the millions in Israel, do not believe in God. But they do believe that God has promised them Palestine as the Holy Land. So it's a ridiculous idea. So that's their ultimate goal actually. And let me add something. Why has our struggle become very famous? Unlike many struggles across the world, there are several other struggles that continue until now for freedom. The Palestinians are facing the blue-eyed sons of the West. The Western civilization or modernity has created Israel. The Europeans and now the Americans have nurtured this colonial project called Israel. So we are fighting famous enemies. It's not that the Palestinians are famous. Yes, the Palestinians are probably more educated than many other populations. We have 99.7% literacy rate, probably the highest rate of PhD holders in the world. Our society has a strong Arab culture and history. The Muslims, the Christians of Palestine are very proud of their faith. But that's not why we are famous. According at least to our one of our national poets, Mahmoud Darwish, we are famous because we are fighting the blue-eyed sons of the West. We are fighting the extension of Western colonial brutality. The same brutality that finished off hundreds of millions of Latin American, African, and Asian people. That's why the world bothers about us, because sometimes the Israelis are hurt. You know, if Israelis finish us off without us fighting back, we wouldn't be having this podcast in the first place. Only because the Palestinians are willing to fight back and hurt the occupiers and do October 7 and this and that. Only because of that, the world bothers to check out what's going on. And I'm talking about the Western world in particular. But of course, we have friends across Asia and Africa and Latin America who would continue to support us regardless.
Now, I want to go into what's a next segment, which is what's happening now, which is, of course, Iran has today morning has declared war on Israel. They have launched about 180 missiles towards Israel. Before this, of course, both US and Israel had warned Iran against repercussions of if they got involved, which they have now. So what are your thoughts on Iran's move?
I think Iran's response was strategic. They gave space for diplomacy after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. Yeah. Remember, Ismail Haniyeh was a state guest attending the presidential inauguration. Yeah. Iran had to respond because their national sovereignty, their image as an independent state was really hurt. Israel had full disregard to Iran's sovereignty when they attacked and killed Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So Iran was thinking how to respond and maximize benefit. If they lashed out and they had an emotional impulse and shot some rockets and that's it, people will say that you could have done more. So I think Iran gave space to diplomacy and they tried to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza. They tried to pressure the Israelis and the Americans to give the Palestinians some freedom to end the genocide. And to me as a Palestinian, that with all, of course, appreciation and regard for Haniyeh, that would have been the best outcome. Although losing Haniyeh was a big loss, but if the genocide stopped, everybody would have appreciated Iran's efforts. But Israel is so intoxicated with its power that it acts so arrogantly and does not want to listen to anybody, does not want to listen to sanity and even to its allies. So Israel continues to bomb Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. Very recently, they assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, a very well-regarded figure across the Muslim world and especially in the Middle East. So I think Iran had to respond. And strategically, because it was not only, they bomb, I bomb and that's it. No, Iran, those who stayed up last night and saw the news, Iran made sure that whatever Israel has gained in terms of deterrence and moral victory in the last few weeks, it has lost in only one night. And their targets, interestingly, were only military targets. Iran's attack on Israel was not with everything it has. Iran still has more military capabilities, but was targeted at military targets to give a message and a lesson to the Israelis that if you want to go for a bigger war, we are able and willing to engage in war, but we are not interested in war. We are interested in ceasefire. So they gave Israel a chance, actually. Now let's see how Netanyahu responds. So far, the pattern of Netanyahu's responses has been very irrational, driven by a fantasy of a greater Israel. But he made some tactical gains here and there, occupying Rafah, occupying Jabalia, maybe killing this man, killing that man. But the big picture is not being able to secure Israel. He only undermined Israel's position in the Middle East like never before. Now anybody can wake up in the morning anywhere in the Middle East and launch a drone on Israel because they have harbored the enmity in the hearts of everybody in the world, not only in the Middle East. You've seen American soldiers putting themselves on fire. There are at least 3 recorded cases of American individuals, cadets, burning themselves to death in solidarity with Gaza and in protest of what Israel is doing. One of them was the very first one who stood in front of the Israeli embassy, poured petrol on himself and put himself on fire and died. He paid his life in protest of what Israel is doing against the Palestinians. So if you manage to antagonize the American people, who are your strongest allies and friends, that means whatever you're doing is crazy. That's not strategy. That's a drunk driver. Netanyahu is a drunk driver.
Now, in this book, the first page is by Syed Farid Alatas. And he talks about the Muslim world, especially in the context of the Middle East. And he talks about how one of the big problems is the involvement of foreign entities, particularly the West. Now, in this book also, there is talk about how Iran has emerged as one of the states that are very against Western interference in the Middle East. If we look at the bombing in Yemen, they bombed the port as well as 2 power stations that had, if I'm not mistaken, the power stations were actually run by Irani entities, if I'm not mistaken. Now, if we've looked at the past, you look at Pearl Harbor, for example. Why Pearl Harbor? Some people theorize that Pearl Harbor was a needed sacrifice for the Americans to enter the war, right? You look at the assassination of JFK. It was another thing that was theorized as America to basically go into Vietnam. In this case, is the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh a way to involve Iran in, and eventually for the West or for Israel to remove or to weaken the main opposers of Western interference in the Middle East?
Well, looking at the Middle East, the American hegemony in the Middle East is something around 80 to 90%. Unlike, for instance, South China Sea, where there is a strong rivalry between the Chinese and Americans. So people in South East Asia and in Asia Pacific in general have some choice. You can still do, hedging, a successful policy of hedging like Malaysia is doing, or you can maybe pick sides. But in the case of the Middle East, countries of the Middle East don't have choice. You are either not a partner of the Americans. You are either under the American hegemony, like most of the countries of Latin America, of course, or you are a rival and an enemy or resistance-defiant state or group. And Iran has, since the collapse of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, has naturally become the leader of the resistance camp in the Middle East, because when the Americans, came to crush Saddam Hussein's regime, their eyes were at the whole map. They wanted to have absolute hegemony. So, and I remember there's a viral video of Muammar Gaddafi, the former Libyan leader, in the Arab League summit, telling all the Arab leaders that after Saddam Hussein's execution, 2005, he was telling them that they are coming after all of you, one by one. So in the American, master game, they want total absolute hegemony in the Middle East, something like what they have in the Monroe Doctrine. America is the most dominant power. There are very small pockets of resistance, Cuba, Venezuela, but America is still the upper voice. In the Middle East, they have like 80 to 90%. Iran is, after the collapse of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, after the collapse of Libya, and after, of course, Syria went through this very painful civil war, Iran emerged as the only major regional power opposing American hegemony. So there is nothing more than crushing Iran that America dreams of. And that's why I fully believe that the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the ongoing Israeli aggression in the Middle East is not only supported by the Americans. Some people say America is complicit in these war crimes. No, it's more than that. It's orchestrated by the Americans. When October 7th happened, the next day, the American president himself came to Israel. The American defense minister came to Israel. Blinken has traveled to the Middle East more than any other region in the world, maybe 11 or 12 times by now. They joined the war cabinet of Netanyahu. They asked other opposition figures to join the cabinet of Netanyahu. The American security institutions started to provide Israel everything, information, intelligence information, strategies, plans. They advised them what to do, what not to do. The only difference between the two sides, maybe two points actually. One is that America prefers clean genocide, kill them silently. And they have been telling them, okay, kill whoever you want to kill, but don't cause a lot of anger. Mistreat Palestinian prisoners, but don't let this leak into media. Do whatever you want in Lebanon, but don't embarrass us in front of our allies and friends in the region. This is one. The other thing is Netanyahu's arrogance. Nobody can bear Netanyahu. And it's well recorded that presidents like Obama, I think Sarkozy, and many other world leaders have cursed him in many occasions because he is unbearable. He's difficult to. He's one of the most narcissistic political figures in modern history. So even for Biden, who gave everything to Netanyahu, he's still unable to bear Netanyahu's arrogance. So back to the point. No, America wants to knock down Iran. They want to knock down the Yemeni government. They want to knock down the Syrian government. They want to knock down everybody. They want to wipe out Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank. But they want to do it nicely. So the chances of a regional war are there, of course. But knowing that the Iranians are rational thinkers, I think they have their own calculations. I don't think the Iranian retaliation yesterday meant that Iran wants a regional war. It only meant that Iran wanted to deter Israel, to maintain some sort of rules of engagement. Iran wants to stop the war in Gaza. Iran does not want a regional war. Most of the resistance powers in the Middle East actually want an end to the genocide in Gaza. They don't want a continuous, perpetual war. But the Israelis want a perpetual war because they have a map in their minds that they want to craft as much as possible. They cannot get rid of the Palestinians in Gaza by sending them to Egypt. Maybe some Israeli thinkers will tell them, send them to Syria, send them to Lebanon. Things like that might happen. They've done that in the past. And of course, not everything that Israel wants will happen because there is a strong resistance on the ground. Let's hope that this Iranian retaliation yesterday brings some sanity to the American decision makers and they bring an end to this ongoing genocide.
In your experience, being the person that you are, you're very well versed with geopolitical issues and the history of the world. When I read this news, and I'm talking from the perspective of the reader, somebody who is you call me, I'm just a civilian.
I am a civilian myself.
Yeah. Should we be worried?
Definitely. When you read the news of the pager, for instance, everybody should be worried. If you are using Israeli technologies or Israeli linked technologies, you have to be worried. If you are using American technologies, to some extent, you also have to be worried. Surveillance is at its highest. They have no respect whatsoever for our personal privacy anywhere in the world. And this does not apply only to genocidal regimes. It applies to some big conglomerates and big companies who are using whatever technologies and big data to control the world. So we have to be alert, of course. But with what's going on in the Middle East, we should be more civilians, and the layman should be worried not only about security aspects. We should be worried about food security. We should be worried about prices of products and goods. What Israel is doing is only, perpetuating an international crisis that will increase the prices of goods and products across the world. It will most probably increase the prices of petrol and energy across the world. Because, once you start heating a plate, the fire will not only heat the center, it will heat the whole. If you like roti canai and you go to a mama shop to buy roti canai, just spend a minute looking at the plate. Don't put your finger, it will hurt you. The fire source is in a few corners, but the whole plate is hot. Israel started this heat in Gaza. It started this heat in Lebanon. It's now starting heat in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The whole Middle East will be on fire. We don't know when. Now maybe half of the Middle East is on fire, but at one point of time, the whole Middle East will explode. Do you think the people of the Middle East, like the Jordanian man who went with his lorry and a gun into the border and shot Israeli soldiers, do you think they will be silent forever? People are so angry. People coming back to the boycott issue. I understand people boycotting Israeli brands, but why are people boycotting every American brand and almost every Western brand? Because the feeling of complicity of these Western countries makes these angry people want to do something. Okay, not everybody is willing to carry a gun like this Jordanian man and go into the border of Israel, but many people are willing to stop buying a coffee that probably aids genocide. Even if it's an allegation, That's why some of these Western brands are collapsing, one after the other. They will continue to collapse as long as the genocide continues in the Middle East. Israel should be curbed. Somebody has to come to hold Netanyahu and stop him from what he's doing, because it will only cause more crisis around the world. And the First World War and Second World War, for that sake, started with 1 or 2 incidents. So I don't think people in 1913 and early 1914 knew that they are going to go into a massive global war that changed the map of the world. But yeah, an incident happened in the Balkan, and eventually the whole world was on fire, or at least the Western world in the First World War. Now, what's happening in the Middle East, and before that, what happened in Ukraine, and the irrationality of the United States in particular, of course, the space they give to Netanyahu will probably lead us to World War III. I really hope this never happens, but it's almost happening, you know.
That's scary.
Some geopolitical thinkers say what's happening is World War III in a different style right now.
What do you mean by that?
Instead of one global war where everybody's fighting everybody, there are so many regional wars happening in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. And for whatever reason, if Trump, for instance, is elected, we might see things happening in South China Sea or even in Southeast Asia. So people have to be prepared and have to be aware. Civilians, individuals, and governments. If your government is not spending enough on food security, on economic sovereignty and independence, on even on armament, necessary armament, then you have to be aware and start to tell decision makers to do something. I don't want to be the bearer of, or the one who brings bad news, but the world today doesn't look that pleasant, you know.
Yeah, it doesn't. It looks very scary. So let's close it on this. I mean, let's try to end it on a positive note if we can.
Okay.
What is your recommendation to peace in this issue of Iran, Israel? How can peace be reached?
It's very possible to reach peace, but America has to take action. Israel is very intoxicated with its power, with the Zionist ideology, and with the right-wing politics, of course, and the desperate struggle of Netanyahu to stay in power forever. You know, when a desperate leader, a desperate dictator, for instance, tries to stay in power at all costs, what happens? The whole system collapses. This happened in the Arab Spring. We are, old enough to remember what happened in the Arab Spring in the Middle East 15 years ago. Several dictators wanted to stay in power at any cost. Those who survived have broken nations now. Many have not even survived, lost their lives, and lost their nations in the process. There are so many war-torn countries in the Middle East because of these individual, disparate leaders. Netanyahu is now another, maybe he was infected by his neighbors in the Middle East. He is a desperate dictator who wants to stay in power, who has tried to change the judicial system, who tried to change the Knesset, to change laws, to evade the corruption charges. To stay in power, he's willing to do what it takes to, destroy everybody else. And of course, when you become genocidal, you also will suffer. But America, still, the establishment especially, forget about the presidential candidates, the American establishment still has rational thinkers, still has, strong institutions. These institutions should come to their senses and end the ongoing crisis in the Middle East by putting an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza. And in the last few weeks, several American diplomats and officials resigned from their workplace because they said, I cannot take it anymore. What our government is doing is endangering the safety and stability of the whole world. I think more of these rational thinkers should pressure the American administration to put an end to this war. And the rest of the world can pressure the Americans. People, across the world, governments across the world have good relations with the Americans. They trade with the Americans. They have cultural ties. They have to talk to them. I see some friends, for instance, who graduated from American universities. They started to speak up. And I tell them that your voice matters probably more than my voice or many other voices, because we as Palestinians are framed by the Americans as terrorists or as enemies or whatever it is. Even though I personally have no problems with the American culture, I like to watch American drama series. I speak English a lot. I like a lot of junk food, which is not healthy, by the way. But I had to boycott a lot of these brands since the start of the genocide in Gaza. We have no problem with the Americans, but they have a problem with us. So I tell these friends who either have American friends or who worked in American institutions, pressure them, talk to them, embarrass them if you have to. All these American activists coming into hearings in the Congress and elsewhere, raising banners, hands, with red paint. That makes a difference. Carry on. Do that. Everything counts. The Americans are the ones who are sponsoring the genocide in Gaza. If there is any political, diplomatic, or civil society pressure that should be done, it should be done on the Americans.
Okay. And with that, we thank you so much for coming on. And I hope you've had it's been wow, what a conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, sir, it's been, thank you for all your wisdom and points that you shared. It's a lot to absorb, and I need some time to take it all in. But thank you for your time. So that's all we have for you all today, folks. So the book is The Middle East and the Malay World, Contemporary Issues and Future Challenges. You can get it on Gerak Budaya, as I mentioned. You can find amazing articles, chapters, and of course 2 by Mr. Muslim Imran that's here. That's really nice and very local and can give you... And when I read this book, I appreciated Islam as a religion, as its history way more, because I saw just what it has done, the relationship between the Middle East and the Malay world, which is something that I never knew was so in-depth only after reading this book. So thank you again, sir, for coming.
Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you and your audience the best.
Thank you. So as always, please share your comments. I'm sure there's going to be plenty. And if you guys would like to connect with Mr. Muslim Imran, please let me know, share, and we will try to connect you all if you want to get in touch. As always, please like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.